Hi, Misha here, and this is one I said I would do quite a long time ago. Really dig into the Supermarine Spitfire of World War II, and to some extent even Korean War fame. This is probably the single most famous RAF fighter of all time. And so I have several versions lined out here. I've got a Mark 1, a Mark 2, a Mark 5, Mark 8, Mark 9, Mark 14, and a Mark 19. Early on, they would write them with Roman numerals up until 44, 45. Then they would switch over to using Arabic numerals after World War II. So there would be up to Mark 24 with 19 variants. So a few of them weren't made or were just basically, design drawings. And of those, there would be many subvariants, over 50. So it's pretty much impossible to figure all of them out. But there are, general things we can talk about. For example, there are the Merlin engined aircraft, and there are the Griffon. Now, the Merlin originally were a single-stage engine. Later, there would be a two-stage, two-speed. But to be fair, the Griffon were the same. Originally single, later two. The Griffons were originally developed for the Royal Navy, who needed more power at lower altitudes, whereas originally the Merlins were designed for the Air Force, who needed medium and high altitude performance. Anywho, let's just kind of dig in here. Talk about the genesis and service. This would be the most produced British plane of all time, with over 20,350 built. And production pretty much lasted continuously before, during, and after World War II. And they were, of course, built by several factories, not just Supermarine, who was actually a very small factory in the beginning. Before we get started, let's kind of talk about the wing types, just to clarify. A wing was typically 4 to 8 .303 caliber machine guns with 300 rounds each. The B-type wing was essentially a modded A-wing, but it had the option of two 20mm cannon, with originally 60 in drums, then later 120 in belts for feeding the cannon. And then it had 4 .303 guns. So we lost 4, but we gained 2 cannon. And the .303 machine guns would have 350 rounds capacity each. The C-wing was the so-called universal, which was made cheaper and easier to produce and more adaptable. The D-wing was the reconnaissance wing, so no real armament, but added fuel and other things for recon. And the E-wing, pretty much the last generation, was pretty much based on the C, but by this point they had discovered that .303 caliber machine guns weren't doing very good. So instead they were using either 50 cal Brownings and 20mm cannon, or just 4 20mm cannon with up to 150 shells each. And there, of course, are even sub-variants of that. All the models here are 1/72 scale die-cast, and all but one is from Corgi. The one outlier is the Mark 9, which is from Forces of Valor. And with that, let's just get into the early history and look at the Mark 1 and Mark 2. The Spitfire had many dimensions and performance specs depending on the version, variant, type, and all that. But roughly speaking, it was about 30 feet long and had a standard wingspan of about 36.5 feet to 37 feet. The pointed tip wings were over 40 feet, and the 32.5 feet wing was known as the clipped. So it was a little bit shorter. The clipped was for kind of low altitude performance, with the pointed extended wingtips for high altitude performance. The average speed was about 370 miles per hour up to about 400 miles per hour, depending on, again, version and variant. And the maximum altitude was between about 35,000 and 38,000 feet. And armament could be 303 machine guns, 50 caliber Browning machine guns, or 20mm Hispano Mark II cannon. So here's a Spitfire Mark I, circa 1940. So towards the beginning of the war, but this was far from the first version. This all the way dates back to 1931, when the Air Ministry needed a new fighter interceptor. Supermarine would submit a design, but it was rejected. Instead, they would go with the Gloucester Gladiator. To that end, 1934-1935, Supermarine would rework their design. They would go to a monowing, they would go to an enclosed canopy. They would eventually add retractable landing gear, at least in the front. They would improve the performance. With the early versions, originally, they were barely able to get over 330 miles per hour. They were able to update this to about 340 to 350. And they upped the machine guns from 2 to 4, 303 caliber, things like that. And it was a very modern all-metal construction. It was designed to be fast, maneuverable, adaptable, but not necessarily long-range or capable of being a fighter-bomber. Finally, the Air Ministry became interested and ordered a prototype, and that first flew in March of 1936. And they were impressed. They initially ordered around 300. And production was supposed to begin immediately, but it took a lot of time. In fact, it would not be until 1938 that the first production Spitfire Mark I was off the assembly line. And this was from several causes. One, this was just a technically advanced aircraft. It flew just a few months after the Hawker Hurricane prototype, but the Hurricane was pretty conventional, while still being modern, but used a lot more wood and whatnot. The Spitfire was stressed metal, and just the manufacturing was more convoluted. It took longer to set up than Supermarine had anticipated, and the British Air Ministry wanted them to outsource production because they were a small factory and they were pretty busy with their flying boats and other designs, but they were reluctant to do so. Obviously, eventually they would, but all these factors kind of combined to delay this fighter's introduction into the RAF until late summer of 1938. And by which time the order had been increased to about 600 units. And this is, well before World War II began. Interestingly, the first versions had 4 303 caliber machine guns, even though they were designed by this point to carry up to 8. This is because they couldn't get their hands on enough machine guns. But many would be retrofit. Also, the first 75 or so had a 2-bladed wooden propeller, but that would be soon replaced by a 3-bladed steel. Note the fixed landing gear in the rear here. No provision for bombs or anything on the Mark I. And early on, this would not even have friend or foe IF identification type. equipment, although it would be added as radar became more and more useful, and the radio would be improved. So even though the Mark I is the Mark I, there would be subsequent updates throughout time. And during the early days, 1940, the Hurricane actually shot down more German aircraft during the Battle of Britain. However, the Spitfire had a better kill-to-loss ratio. And it was just more of an iconic and elegant aircraft, so it gained a lot of traction and attention here. So the Mark I, after a few improvements like the new propeller, could get up to about 367 miles per hour maximum speed, and had an altitude of about 34,000 feet. It was gaining a little weight just because of necessities like modern radio equipment, a little bit of armor, bulletproof windscreen, but it was still a pretty light and nimble fighter. But it was the Mark I after all, so there was always room for improvement. Plus, the RAF needed more than Supermarine could produce. First major update to the Spitfire was the Mark II. This is a Mark IIA, so it has the machine gun wings still. These were built with an upgraded Merlin single-stage engine, and they had newer equipment for radio and IF and the like. It was a heavier aircraft, but generally more capable. It was faster at low level than the Mark I, not by much, 5-7 miles per hour. Although as it would climb higher, it would lose a lot of this. So it was more of an incremental change and kind of solidifying all the various updates that the Mark I had seen. And these were not produced at Supermarine. These were produced at the new factory at Castle Bromwich. And they do use a different propeller for whatever that's worth. Still a 3-blade, but a few small differences like that. But all in all, still the same basic airframe. By April and May of 1941, these had pretty much replaced the Mark I in frontline RAF units, and they would build over 900 of these. And the older Mark Is were kind of retired to other theaters or to the reserves. But of course, this was only the beginning. There was a large threat, not only from German bombers, but also the FW-190, the Focke-Wulf. The next full production version would be the Mark V here, and this is a Mark V-B, which was the most produced one. It has the two 20mm cannon in the wings, as well as 4 303 machine guns still. The 5B here was the first that could take a drop tank under the fuselage, and the 5C actually was the first that could carry bombs. Originally, it was usually just a couple of 250-pound bombs under the wings. This had yet another improvement on the single-stage Merlin engine, and another improved propeller. And it has a new top speed of about 375 miles per hour. So about 10 miles per hour faster, and is a little more capable, and can be used more for ground attack than previous versions. And this was very much an interim solution. They pretty much put it together on the fly. They were already working on, hopefully vastly improved versions, but this is what they could get into the field in early 1942 to counter improvements in German aviation. So, part of that arms race. And it's a pretty iconic aircraft because it served not only in Britain, but it served in foreign theaters, especially like the Middle East. But even though it has a more powerful engine, it's still pretty much the same aircraft. Although the B and C wings are starting to really replace the older A wings. They're starting to learn that lesson about the 303 machine guns, but they're not quite ready to give up on them. Or it's just because they had them available, so why not? Next up, the Mark 9. Because that's how numbers work, right? I'll get back to the other ones in a minute. But this was the first two-stage, two-speed Merlin. Well, sort of. This was a stopgap measure. They tried using the single-stage Merlin in a high-altitude variant known as the Mark 6. And it could get higher, up to about 39,000 feet. But it only could achieve about 250 to 260 miles per hour at that altitude. Even at low altitudes, because of the changes, the longer wings that it had, it was a little slower at about 355 to 360 miles per hour. So all around, not much of a success. Luckily, they had been working on the two-stage Merlin, and while they were working on a full kind of redesign, in the interim, they took the Mark 5C and they plugged the two-stage engine into it, along with a new four-bladed propeller. And this became the Mark 9. Now, initially, these were produced at the Castle Bromwich and the Supermarine factory, but after 1942, only Bromwich would continue producing the Mark 9. This was just stopgap, another one, to try to counter newer variants of the Focke-Wulf, but it was actually very successful. It could reach altitudes up to 40,000 feet, had pretty good power even up there, and at lower altitudes, even though it had two 20mm cannon, it could still achieve about 370 miles per hour, and it could carry either a drop tank under the belly and or bombs under the wings. It could actually carry a total of 2,000 pounds of ordnance, 1,000 pounds of ordnance, one 500-pound bomb under the belly, and two 250s under the wings, like on this model here. So it had some ground attack ability too. So it ended up being produced in quite large numbers, being one of the top 3 most produced variants, and it was really something they just kind of slapped together. And at the same time, the high-altitude threat from bombers that Britain had been anticipating ever since 1940-41, by late 1942, they realized it's not coming. Germany's not really progressing its bombers, and the war is finally starting to turn in favor of the Allies with the landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, and eventually the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and so on and so forth. So goals and objectives and needs are changing. Mark 8 Spitfire. Now the Mark 7 was a two-stage, two-speed Merlin, and it had a pressurized cockpit. And it had quite good performance in altitude. And really the Mark 8 was an unpressurized version. And this was a pretty radical redesign. Looking at the model, most noticeably we have a new retractable tail wheel. Now the C, D, and E wing is the standard. The A's and B's are pretty much out. We've also reworked the landing gear. We had the four-bladed propeller. And we've started using new equipment. And this was intended to be the next mass-produced version. And they did build these over 1600. But the Mark 9 did so much better than they expected that it ended up kind of eclipsing the Mark 8, which, while it was put in development before the Mark 9, came into service after it. In performance on this, it could achieve an altitude of about 38 to 40,000 feet again, and depending on the exact variant, it had a top speed of between 400 and 415 miles per hour. And again, we're starting to see the second generation of these Merlin two-stage engines with it as well. And again, it can carry bombs and or tanks, plus the internal tanks hold about 22 gallons more of fuel, which is always helpful. And these were mostly used overseas. For example, the Middle East and the Pacific Theater. And yeah, it really starts the next generation of Spitfires, which is also the last really ones to have the Merlin engine. But of course, production would continue throughout World War II. This is another Corgi. It's an older one, you can tell by the stand, but still a good one. It's got the later features, like the new aerial. They've slightly updated the canopy with these. The fuselage is slightly stretched because of the engine. Little changes like that. Pretty neat. But let's move on to the next generation. And now we come to the Griffon engine aircraft, Spitfires. These did not replace the two-stage Merlins, but rather supplemented them later on. Actually, work for a more powerful engine version really began all the way back in 1939 with an eye towards making a variant for the Royal Navy. It needed an aircraft with more power, especially at low and medium altitude, so it could take off and land from a carrier, and also have better range endurance for operating over water. And the first prototype, known as the Mark IV, with the Griffon engine, flew in November of 1941, but there were several delays and setbacks. Some of them had to do with engine availability. Others just had to do with the engine itself. It was a heavier engine, which required a redesign of the airframe, and therefore problems. Next up, and basically the Mark IV would transition over to the Mark X, and the first real production model with the Griffon engine, which was be a single stage, would be the Mark XII. And the Mark XII had some issues. At low altitude, it was faster than a Merlin, actually about 15 miles per hour faster. But because of the heavier engine, it lost a little bit in maneuverability. It tended to want to yaw. And over 20,000 feet, it actually lost power and suffered. So it wasn't great. Thus, we get the Mark XIV here. This was the first major production variant. They would build over 900 of these. They never would build as many Griffon-powered Spitfires as they would Merlins, not anything close. But it was a major sub-variant, major class nevertheless. The Mark XIV had a two-stage, two-speed Griffon engine, which was still very fast down low, but also performed very well past 20,000 feet. In fact, its optimum altitude was about 26,000 feet, at which it could get over 440 miles per hour. Not bad. It also had a lot of the refinements. Pretty much it was based on the Mark 8, the Mark 7, the Mark 8. It had the retracting tail wheel. At this point, they're using the E-wing, which can either have two 20mm cannon and two 50 cals, or just four 20mm cannon. We've also gone to a new aerial, which is no longer just sticking up on the back. And you'll notice with the Mark 14 we're going to a new propeller with 5 blades. So we started off with actually 2 in the original Spitfire, then 3, and then 4. Now we're up to 5. They even tried it out with 6, but settled on 5. And that's to work with the heavier, more powerful engine. We're also going to this new canopy style, this bubble canopy. To be fair, the bubble canopy would appear on late Mark 9s as well. The Mark 14 would first fly in January of 1943 and would enter squadron service at the end of that year. And actually, it was very important in 1944 in countering the V-1 flying bomb, the doodlebug, the buzz bomb threat. It was really the only Spitfire fast enough and they could reach a high enough altitude to successfully shoot down V-1s. So it became quite important for that. And so it was in service throughout 1944 in Europe, and it did get transferred to the Pacific in 1945, but it got there so late that the war was practically over, so it never really ended up against the Japanese. Production would continue after the war for a brief time, and the Mark 14 would stay in service throughout the 1940s. It would also lead to the Mark 18, an improved version with more fuel reserves and reinforced, stronger wings so it can be a little more rigid, carry more ordnance for ground attack. But the Mark 18, while it was designed at the tail end of World War II, by the time it was in production, the war was over. But it did see some service before and during the early stages of Korea. And with that, we're pretty much at the end of the Spitfire fighters. But we have one more variant to talk about. The Mark 19 PR for photo reconnaissance. And this is often written either with Arabic or Roman numerals because it was during that transitional period. Now, the Spitfire, really almost since its very beginning, have been used as a reconnaissance photography aircraft. Early versions were simple retrofits given cameras. Later versions like this were more specialized. And this really was the ultimate photo reconnaissance Spitfire. It's basically a Mark 14, but with the pressurized cabin of the Mark 7. So this is pressurized here. Instead of guns, it had either 2 cameras in the wings or 1 camera on the fuselage. And it relied on speed and altitude for defense. In fact, this was pretty much the fastest production standard Spitfire. It could achieve up to about 460 miles per hour and could go in excess of 40,000 feet. Not bad at all for a piston engine aircraft. And of course it still is the Griffon engine. We still have the 5-blade propeller. Still have the fully retractable gear or wheel in the back. These entered into service in 1944, so were used during the last year or so of the war, and actually production would continue through about 1946 with about 225 built, which is a very large number for a photo reconnaissance dedicated aircraft. And these were very much in active service during the Korean War. They were used many times throughout that war, and is quite famously known in 1951, per request of the U.S. Air Force, the British would use the Mark 19 flying out of Hong Kong to take photographs of communist China, see what they're up to. They would continue to see use throughout the war and after the war to monitor the situation in Southeast Asia. And really, they did not take their final flights until the early 1960s. And they were used for some war gaming. And another famous incident in 1963, a Spitfire of this type was used to kind of simulate an attack run on an English Electric Lightning. And there we have it, a bit of a closer look at the Supermarine Spitfire. Like I said at the beginning, over 20,350 were built, with main production running from 1938 all the way up to about 1946, with limited production for a couple of years after that, and service all the way throughout World War II, and pretty much in every theater that Britain was involved in World War II. They were also tested and flown by America and by France, and many were given to Russia. And of course the Germans captured some too. From the very beginning here with the Mark I and the original Merlin engine, what made this special was it was a dedicated fighter interceptor, but it was made in such a way that it was modern to begin with, but it was also flexible, being able to use different wings, and it was easy to be retrofitted with new engines. Like I said, originally it had only 4 303 machine guns, although it was always meant to have 8. But then already by the Mark II, they were going to a more powerful single-stage Merlin, and thinking about cannon and adding more fuel and more electronics, better radio, better IF gear, and increasing the performance, both altitude and speed. Then you get to the Mark V and the Mark IX. Both were interim measures, but actually very successful for what they were. We have the last really major variant with the single stage Merlin, then we move into the 2-stage. And it's kind of funny that the Mark VIII, with its pretty radical redesigned body, while it was successful, really kind of got sidetracked by the Mark IX. And it's also around this time that cannon really start to replace the machine gun, and it becomes capable of carrying extra fuel tanks and 250 and 500 pound iron bombs. And then moving into our Griffons here again, one thing to point out they started doing with later production, they went to flush riveting, which probably doesn't sound all that special today, but little modern touches like that allowed these to be easily manufactured, but also more aerodynamic, a little bit faster, a little bit better acceleration, just all around a nice choice. And that's the thing, the Spitfire, even though it was an old design, you know, it's contemporary with the BF-109, but whereas the Spitfire emerged from World War II, a very capable modern piston aircraft, the Bf-109, along with, for example, the Japanese A6M0, which actually came into service well after the Spitfire. These aircraft were hopelessly obsolete by 1945, and a lot of it had to do with the design and the power plant and just the general role that it played. It's also very nice to be winning a war. It means resources are a lot more available. And these are far from all the versions for sure. In fact, the last officially named one was the Mark 24, I believe. But these are the major ones, I think. Mark 1, Mark 5, Mark 9. And I would definitely add the Mark 14 in there just because it was so interesting. In the beginning, with the first production models, they were barely able to get over 350 miles per hour. And by the end, with certain versions, they're exceeding 450 miles per hour. In the beginning, they're mounting 303 caliber machine guns, and at the end, they're mounting 20mm cannon, plus able to carry bombs. In the beginning, altitude is under 35,000 feet, and at the end, it's well over 40,000. Endurance and armor were also improved throughout time. Yeah, just a very progressive aircraft. And I'm a big fan of the Hurricane too. I really like the Hawker Hurricane. It's a very neat plane, and I think it's underappreciated. The Spitfire gets a lot of the attention and glory. The Hurricane is often overlooked. But there is something about a Spitfire. So what do you think? Hope I did a decent job here for you. And there's plenty of excellent documentaries out there on this fine piece of not just aviation, but world history. Anyway, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And feel free to comment below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.